Jordan, bom dia. É,
De países africanos e do mundo e de outros lugares do mundo. Essa edição, como vocês já sabem, acontece sempre às terças e quintas, às 10 horas, horário de Brasília, com pequenos atrasos, de no máximo 10 minutos. A gente ainda está afinando algumas coisas. Temos mais de 30 professores e estudantes de doutoramento de diferentes partes do mundo aqui. E eu queria fazer uns agradecimentos iniciais, né, porque o Fábrica de Ideias é um evento em parceria com o Programa de Pós-Graduação em Estudos Étnicos da UFBA, o Programa de Pós-Graduação da Antropologia da UFBA e da Unicamp, o Programa de Pós-Graduação em Políticas Públicas da Universidade Federal do Maranhão, e ainda a gente conta com o apoio do Cluster de Excelência em Pesquisa, o Africa Cluster of Excellence da Universidade Bayreuth. Assim como toda a equipe de realização do Fábrica e a equipe da AGS9 Comunicações por estar nos auxiliando, muito obrigado. Nós contamos com o apoio da Universidade de Cabo Verde, da Pró-Reitoria de Extensão da UFBA, da Associação Brasileira de Antropologia, Associação Nacional de Pós-Graduação e Pesquisa em Ciências Sociais e a Associação Brasileira de Ciência Política e a Sociedade Brasileira de Sociologia. A todos os envolvidos, muito obrigada pela partilha ativa do seu tempo conosco. Eu informo que é necessário sempre estarem atentos à presença, porque somente certificaremos quem tiver 75% de presença. Ela vai ficar aberta até 30 minutos depois que a gente...
it is going to be opened for 30 minutes. The chat is going to be open for any questions you might have. Reminding you that and requesting you that you summarize your questions so that we allow other people to participate. We are going to open up our next live panel. It's going to be taught by Professor Charbel Elahani, Professor Yun King, and Professor Fernandes. Thank you for being here and sharing so generously your time and your... Professor Charbel is an associate professor of biology at the Federal University of Bahia and history of biology. He has a doctoral degree in philosophy of nature at the University of Copenhagen, and he coordinates the studies of intense interdisciplinary studies in evolution studies. First, we also count on Professor Bonan Mattiolo, who is associate professor and a specialist in health and social protection. He's a PhD in social change and development from the University of Technology in advanced studies in anthropology, applied anthropology, and health from the University of Missanti in France. He's also got a degree in sociology from the same university. He was the director of his unit at the University of Burkina Faso. And his research field is medical anthropology and public health. We count on the mediation of Professor Yun King, who is a professor in
African Studies,
the editor of Ethnic Studies, and she teaches political science at the California Institute in Political Economy, Democratic Consolidation, and Compared Politics and International Relations. And she is particularly focused on issues of African policies and politics, when she has conducted field work in Zambia, Kenya, and she's welcome here, Professor Kim. I'm now going to have Professor Kim, and I hope you are all ready to also check the Portuguese channel. And Professor Felipe and Raquel is going to be translating. Thank you. You're all welcome. See you in a bit. Professor Young King.
O YouTube travou e voltou. Como estamos?
Yes.
William, há pedido no chat.
Para voltar um pouquinho.
Sim, para sintetizar e começar, porque parece que travou tudo, se bem entendi.
Sim, tá bom. Vocês me ouvem agora?
Can you hear me now? Is it okay?
Yes.
Travou só por um breve período. Então, como eu ia dizendo,
As I was stating, today we are going to have, I have already presented the acknowledgement. I hope you have heard the instructions about how to have access to the channels. And he has already also introduced all of the CVs. He's reading everybody's bios again. So, Professor Kim, can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Good. Professor Charbel, can you hear me well?
Socioantropólogo, especialista em saúde e proteção social na
So he's
universidade.
introducing everybody again. It seems like they're having some problems with the audio.
Pela Universidade de Lille e atuou anteriormente como diretor da universidade.
He's currently the director of his unit at the university. His research is in medical anthropology and public health. Our mediator is Professor Kim at the Foreign Studies University of Hancock. She is the editor of the Studies Journal, and she's got a PhD from the University of California. She is currently, her research fields are African politics and political economy and democratic consolidation. I think that after this delay, we all can hear each other. We apologize for this technical failure, and we are going to start with Professor Kim.
Professor Kim? Excuse me, are you there?
Professor Kim.
Yes. It's my turn to.
Yes, it is your turn. Please.
Oh,
Fernando, excuse me. William, primeiro Charbel, depois Fernando, Kim é debatedora, vem depois.
Oh, ok. Sorry. Sim. Professor Charbel, seja bem-vindo.
Ok, obrigado.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the opportunity. Can you hear me well? I hope so. First of all, I would like to talk about my perspective. I'm a biologist and I'm a specialist in biology studies, and my perspective comes from these areas where I work. I am going to start with this hope without optimism. And the first thing that we need to consider is that the occurrence of a pandemic such as this is hardly a surprise. The scientific community has predicted the emergence of a new pandemics that would be transmitted from animals to humans in consequence of how our global societies have been interacting with systems and ecological systems. The argument in 2012 is strategies of vigilance should be implemented in order to prevent and control these pandemics. and in terms of a global strategy to deal with the pandemics and answer and prevention of pandemics. In 2013, we published actually a work explaining that coronavirus would be a probable event that would cause such pandemics. And what I see in the media is that people would go back to these conspiracy theories that the virus was generated in a Chinese lab. Is very improbable, this hypothesis, and this transmission was from the most supported theory. So this is part of predictions and demonstrate the failures of societies in moving towards avoiding the pandemics that would affect harshly humanity as much as it has affected us. It makes explicit all the dilemmas that we have in terms of how we have developing our societies, we have been developing our societies, the zoonotic transmission of pathogens that evolve rapidly and may then become capable of infecting humans, but in fact, in light of environmental degradation in the way we our lifestyles, in terms of, for example, the transmission and evolution of coronavirus as an agent that would cause future pandemics, makes it crystal clear and obvious the need to preserve wildlife. However, what these pandemics have placed us is a challenge of how to deal with the situation that we have in our hands, not in terms of the pandemics itself, but more profoundly, the situation of the ways in which our species has been positioning itself in the world, creating risks for other species in itself. We could be sufficiently humble in order to embrace the pandemics using hope without optimism, which is what I am hoping, I'm focusing here, citing. The hope without optimism implies being humble, a sense of a responsibility vis-a-vis the past, and a moral a duty with the future, and depends on distinguishing these concepts taken as synonyms of being optimist as being hopeful. It seems like when we distinguish these concepts, it's important because this distinction matters in terms of the consequences. We need to know if these two concepts are distinct. We need to understand their consequences. If the consequences different, the concepts are different. So we need to distinguish optimism from hope. Let's start from hope. Hope is based on a critical attention to the reality of circumstances, from which a trajectory for a better future that is configured as an utopia may be traced. Optimism, on the contrary, is an expectation about the future that has no grounding in reality, making these anticipations as positive as groundless and making them at less. And I agree that optimism should be distinguished from charlatalism. On the other hand, hope may be understood as a commitment of engaging with reality in humble ways. In the words of Hutan, a residue that refuses to give away its resilience then comes from opening to a possibility of disasters with no solution. It is so easy as senseless because it doesn't offer any reliable course so that we can navigate tormented waters and blinds us to solutions to solve these problems. We have many people who are extremely optimistic, who are living an optimistic life. Of course, they are as optimistic as blind. It is confused and uncertain because it commits itself to maintaining through reality that is confusing and uncertain. But hope opens up our eyes so that we can understand in what circumstances we find ourselves and what are the plans that we may trace so that we may have a vision of the future so that we can move in terms of steps that we may take in our path. It helps us have a place to go, and so it allows us reason. And it is certainly easier to face situations such as this when our lives are lives that have a reason for being. And that's the way, and it's more probable that we may face these situations with our eyes open and more hopeful instead of a negationist happiness, of negationist that is extremely there. So given that their eyes are closed, if we want to advance to a possible future with hopeful futures, we need to think fundamentally and be informed about in most appropriate ways. We need to be able to
das nossas circunstâncias. Uma vez que nós tenhamos essa compreensão, esse conhecimento crítico e atento da realidade, nós podemos, então, começar a pensar sobre como poderíamos nos organizar para enfrentar essa pandemia e todos os outros problemas que o antropoceno já nos trouxe e que continuará nos trazendo. Para esse fim, todos nós precisamos nos tornar melhores aprendizes como humanidade do que nós temos sido até agora. Infelizmente, a pandemia da COVID-19 tem sido marcada por eventos que mostram quão longe muitos de nós estão de sermos bons aprendizes. Ao longo do globo, uma quantidade grande de pessoas sucumbiu a teorias da conspiração, boatos, falta de informação, mais do que parece aceitável em sociedades que estão simplesmente à beira de um abismo. A infodemia que tem acompanhado a pandemia é uma ameaça significativa que requer os nossos melhores esforços para combatê-la. Esse é o meu preâmbulo, passo agora a tratar da Covid como um problema perverso, em inglês, um wicked problem, que me parece um conceito importante para entender a atual pandemia. Então, desde sua emergência, a Covid-19 ela se espalhou por todo o globo devido a características dessa doença. Por exemplo, é uma doença altamente contagiosa, com transmissão efetiva de humanos a humanos, mesmo a partir de portadores assintomáticos e pré-sintomáticos. Outro fator que contribuiu para a Covid ter se espalhado tanto, obviamente, é a escassez de agentes terapêuticos efetivos e a falta de vacinas. Agora, primeiro, porque a gente não tinha uma vacina, né? Agora, devido à disponibilidade de vacinas, marcada por um grande componente sociopolítico, do qual eu não vou tratar aqui. A gente até mesmo pode dizer que a pandemia da Covid-19 corresponde à maior crise de saúde pública dessa geração e, potencialmente, é a pior crise desde a pandemia de gripe espanhola de 1918 a 1920, que reivindicou 50 milhões de vidas. Em 8 de maio de 2021, o dashboard da OMS registrava mais de 156 milhões de casos confirmados cumulativos de Covid-19 e mais de 3 milhões de mortes ao redor do mundo. Essas figuras são muito maiores do que aquelas observadas na epidemia de SARS-CoV-1 de 2003, que afetou cerca de 8 mil indivíduos em todo o globo e foi associado a 774 mortes. Além disso, é muito claro que essas figuras, esses valores, tanto para casos confirmados como para mortes, estão subestimados devido ao fato de que há baixos números de testes diagnósticos, dificuldade de identificação de casos de razões de óbito em vários países do mundo. A apresentação da doença também contribui para a sua subnotificação, uma vez que a Covid-19 é uma doença em que cerca de 80% dos pacientes mostram apresentações menos graves, às vezes até assintomáticas. Enquanto o custo global para a economia de todo o mundo, da epidemia de SARS, foi estimada como variando entre 30 bilhões de dólares e 100 bilhões de dólares, As estimativas do impacto da Covid-19 sobre a economia mundial eram, ainda em 9 de março de 2020, já de cerca de US$ 1 trilhão, e seguiu aumentando desde então, tendo levado a uma diminuição da economia global por volta de 8% no ano de 2020. Em 13 de maio, as Nações Unidas estimavam, em 13 de maio do ano passado, né? Então, em 13 de maio de 2020,
May 13th, the United States has estimated that the global economy was going to lose around trillions of dollars in light of COVID-19. In light of these circumstances, a number of people, including, have neglected their societies, have neglected the agents that causes COVID-19 spreading to humans, and that may be these chains of transmission. While a number of optimists have kept their eyes closed, there is recurring images
unidades de terapia intensiva, falta de recursos críticos, como ventiladores e equipamentos de proteção
with lack of protection equipment and ventilators, even for teams, and the lack of qualified workers. The situation is particularly serious for low-income countries that have systems of healthcare that are more limited. I'm not going to go through this subject matter, but something that should be mentioned is that in the beginning of the pandemics, the notion was that Africa was going to have the worst circumstances for the pandemics, and why should we debate why Africa has not registered such numbers, and why Brazil, on the other hand, and India are notable cases in terms of this healthcare crisis. Aside from that, in terms of looking after issues caused by COVID-19, probably have been causing mortality rates in light of other healthcare circumstances. What should we expect in order to deal with these challenges? And we have to approach the totality of society and government, all of us united in order to combat the pandemics. However, many countries, we see the opposite of that. And Brazil is by far one of the best examples of this critical state of affairs, who states that we are exaggerating the impact of COVID-19 in Brazil. In Brazil, we have 28% of the global population. But in March 8th, 12.8% of the deaths had occurred in Brazil. In May 8th, over 400,000 people had died on May 8th. Should have let us, the country, quiet. So we have these numbers in terms of death rates and global population. 1 per 8 people who died by COVID died in Brazil. 1 out of 8 people who died of COVID died in Brazil. Brazil demonstrates how it has become a perverse problem. In the literature about planning, we understand this as problems in which there's a broad disagreement about the problem. And of course, if we don't have an agreement about the problem itself, we cannot get to any agreements of how to address this problem, on how to address this problem. In the case of how to manage the pandemics, the perverse nature of this problem has affected not only issues of prevention, but also how we could then the influx of new cases. And in order to do that, the best measures, now vaccination is making a difference in countries such as Israel and in Brazil, perhaps, I'm not sure, but the public health measures such as quarantine and contention of community transmission have been fundamental issues in order to prevent COVID and its social impact as much as personal prevention measures, such as wearing masks. However, it has been difficult to visualize how these measures may be applied in appropriate ways in fair ways. In countries and regions of the world in which there are high levels of inequality, such as Brazil and other countries in the world, the effective use of these measures, therefore, would demand a very focused approach in scientists, decision makers, academics, public agencies, medias, corporations, third sector organizations from which we would expect an approach to such unequal circumstances. An integrated approach would then lead to more effective, synergetic interventions, but that's highly probable when the problem becomes as perverse upon which there's no agreement about what is the problem exactly. We may observe how COVID-19 has become a problem of this nature when we see political leaders and decision makers stuck in this fake dilemma between human and economic health. Of course, the necessary measures really have very complex cost-benefit relationships, both psychological and social and political issues. But then flattening the curve would be a way of devastating the economy. It has been argued by economists that healthcare measures are the best option also for economic approach in spite of some of the harms it may be causing to economic sectors. Because if we prolong the pandemics, you may solve it in a shorter period of time. The death rates may have more cost to society than the economic difficulties caused by the necessary measures. Aside from that, the inefficacy in handling care measures in such a way that it would quickly flatten the curve and allow society to go back to a number of activities may have this economic crisis to extend for a long period of times and worsening the situation. The dichotomy is problematic because it neglects the complexity of the case that incorporates important dilemmas, such that may not be reduced to superficial analysis, but require cost-benefit analysis. We may also think about different paths in order to address the issue. For example, different terms of commitment and public health in order to flatten the curve and maintain different stages of the pandemics. What's become easier as the scientific community has produced data about how the disease may be spread. For example, the control of the pandemics and the economy, different social agreements are stuck to partial readings of the circumstances. And that makes the situation even worse because when a problem is perverse, it is not consensually enunciated as a significant measure, the search for solutions becomes open in different parts who are interested, defending alternative solutions and competing with one another in order to ameliorate the problem, quotation marks, connecting its solution to its best definition of the problem, satisfying its own interests and its own values. It seems that moderating COVID-19 as a perverse problem has led us to a relevant interpretation of what has happened all over in many countries in the world as they face the pandemics. We have been watching repeatedly the many social actors from which society depends in order to navigate the pandemics, failing in communicating and integrating perspective, failing in acting accordingly, making more probable the approach that has been pointed out necessary in order to deal with these pandemics, involving a totality of governments and a totality of society. Instead of seeing this handling of the situation, what we see is a number of partial solution approaches from different perspectives that are sustained by different social actors according forcing its implementation and unavoidably leading us to failure. What I find funny is the weekend quarantine. It works very well if you combine it, if you have agreements with the virus between 10 and 5 a.m. If you have agreements with the virus, it might work. But since the virus doesn't make any agreements, these measures have not been efficient. My third point and last point is which is COVID-19, my COVID-19 post-truth and infodemia. When we consider perverse COVID-19 has become as a problem since its first weeks, it's important to think about some points raised that we could have a broad discussion, a balanced discussion about the pandemics at the international level. We could expect, for example, that the brouhaha and the confusion around a number of drugs that would address these issues and its replacement from a more rational that may have happened after 1 year of this pandemic. It is necessary to consider why hasn't it happened in other countries, because the answers that we have reached demonstrate how naive it is, this expectation of a balanced debate and rational debate about the pandemics in current days. We also should be debating how it is a part of the rights of the population related to health to have access to reliable information that may empower them as citizens, particularly the right of the population to have right of information from public agents. In order to explore these issues, I am going to think about the instrumentalization of COVID-19 for political purposes. This is a key aspect of what has been called post-truth times. As Fuller has described, the phenomenon has to do with the inversion of the use of facts. Alternative facts have actually been proposed as in utilized for political purposes. It has always been used politically, but there seems to be at least a bigger concern with their epistemological roles. For example, the role of allowing us to learn about the state of things in the natural world and not invent the state of affairs that we would like to invent. Before, there was more concern, it seems to me, with epistemological roles than the current reduction to facts and mere instruments and alternative facts that become tools in social networks in order to destabilize certain political discourses. It is very serious to have a situation such as this because, unfortunately, the natural world doesn't care about our favorite topics. It doesn't matter what they are. The state of affairs operates regardless of them. The speed, these approaches, we have seen over the year the ability for the scientific community of responding to such serious circumstances. A large volume of being invested in possible therapies that provided answers to challenges in the pandemics. It is true then that the speed in which these scientific findings were spread had a crucial role in this healthcare crisis as a way of reducing the panic as much as possible and establishing information to epidemiologists that were seeking to deal with patients and researchers who were investigating possible treatments and strategies of prevention. It is also true that the speed of these pandemics, there has been an availability of evidence of low quality, still not enough, that has led decision makers and people who were not familiarized with scientific work were very tempted to defend treatments and other approaches based on insufficient research. Poor information around COVID-19 has become so impressive, both for traditional media and social media, that in February 2020, OMS had stated that we are not only fighting against an epidemic, we are also fighting against an infodemic. And the term is used to refer to an abundance of information that then make it difficult for people to find reliable sources and reliable information when they need these informations and advices. Of course, in current times, it's not an issue of public health care. Even public health is not an issue that has just emerged with COVID-19. It has been an issue in other public health emergencies. Ebola, for example, in Congo, has demonstrated how social media was connected to violence, social disturbances, and it has actually resulted in attacks to public health officials and public health workers. Workers were deliberately, was the lie, spreading the virus and interfered in their ability to deal with patients and communicate with the people about how to efficiently handle the pandemics. The current pandemics has spread rumors and misinformation in very notable ways. In an analysis of online platform, in 2020, there was at least 2,000 different time rumors being spread through 87 countries in 25 languages. Amongst these reports, I repeat, 2,000, over 2,000, 82%, 9% were correct, and 8% were misleading. This infodemia may have serious implications, particularly when it masks itself as credible information for prevention and treatment of the disease. And we may also assert that the COVID-19 infodemia has demonstrated that low literacy is a public health issue that is underestimated. Have approaches that have been disseminated, such as gargling with warm salt water and lime and others, could be effective treatment for COVID-19, that you could be contaminated through cell phones, that it was just a common cold, that if you drank and tea mixed with camel urine, you could kill the virus. If you could spread chloride over your body, cocaine could cure the disease. All of these propositions that were pointless. That consuming alcohol could also kill the virus. 800 people in the Middle East were killed and over 5,000 hospitalized after drinking methanol. So it means that we are not dealing with a situation that there's a failure in terms of education and in terms of our communication in situations such as these. I am walking towards my conclusion, in which I am going to talk about the situation of this post-truth world, talking about academic scientific knowledge. If we demonstrate that this knowledge is well successful in circumstances and aspects that are taken as revelations of the reality of things, we may not neglect that many scientists, even the most trained ones, may become If we are talking about the neutrality of facts, we may not despise the fact that scientists' approach to sacralizing facts, it sees this full truth reality from a more well-informed position. They have researchers that are most certainly committed to this notion that nature is handled through supports, through data analysis. And that doesn't mean, however, that we should go to the extreme in which scientific reasoning should abandon evidence, and that scientists may be critical in terms of what we have in understanding hypotheses that should be consistent in subjacent theories, so that we could have this data that should not have convincing possibilities in terms of basing theories that are absolutely useless, and understanding how this data is then based on observational data, based on evidence from interpretative processes produced by trained specialists, and so on and so forth. Of course, if we don't have an academic training in terms of how science works, it's very hard that we should expect the population in general and decision makers and political agents to have an understanding of how science works. So it seems to me that the situation we live with COVID-19 asks us to rethink the way we in academia understand what we do with science, particularly in terms of we're going to work with scientific education. How are we going to have scientific education that teaches less encyclopedic knowledge and help people think clearly about issues that related to the state of the natural world? Thank you. Thank you, Professor Chardell. Thank you for your excellent explanation. Now we are moving to, now you are going to have your questions placed here, and we are going to have Professor.
Oui, allô, je vous entends. Allô?
Bem-vindo, professor. Professor Felipe. Tá. O professor Felipe já está se comunicando com o professor e eu vou sair de cena para começarem.
Oui?
Olá, professor. O professor Felipe, por gentileza, deu um auxílio aqui no processo de tradução, que o professor Dr. Bartiono já pode iniciar sua fala.
C'est à vous la parole, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, d'accord, merci. Alors, c'est comme je disais que ma communication va être faite en français. Et je suppose que la traduction sera simultanée. Et je vais déjà commencer par dire que c'est une situation, je vais peut-être réduire pour qu'on puisse voir. Non, bon, écoutez, ça ne marche pas. Voilà. Donc, le sujet auquel je me suis intéressé, c'est le COVID-19 entre les acteurs et comment est-ce que ces différents acteurs vont négocier la gestion du COVID au Burkina. Alors, Dans un premier temps, je vais vous donner un aperçu sur ce qui a été observé au Burkina à partir du mois de mars, où 246 cas positifs ont été notifiés. Et après, à la date du 30 mars, il y a eu 261 cas. Et ensuite, on a constaté une progression qu'au 31 mars, c'est 281 cas confirmés, dont 94 femmes et 188 hommes. Donc, on peut dire qu'il y a une légère accélération de l'épidémie depuis la notification au mois de mars, puisque quand on regarde aujourd'hui, on a dépassé la barre de 9000 cas. Et pour être plus récent, le 5 avril 2021, le pays compte 12 845 cas confirmés, donc 37,55% de femmes et 62,45% d'hommes notifiés par le centre des opérations mis en place dès l'annonce du COVID-19. Alors, ensuite, suite à ces éléments épidémiologiques, le directeur général de l'OMS, World Organization Health, il va faire la déclaration d'une pandémie mondiale. Et à partir de cet instant, il faut aller vers l'adoption et l'application de mesures barrières pour tout le monde. Il n'y a pas d'exceptionnalité. Et tout le monde doit pouvoir se protéger soi-même et protéger aussi les autres. Ensuite, au niveau du Burkina Faso, il y a eu une déclaration du président qui montre l'intérêt à accorder à la lutte contre le COVID-19. Et nous sommes partis sur ce constat à partir d'une revue documentaire, des interviews que nous avons réalisées, des interviews formelles et informelles, et aussi quelques observations directes que nous avons pu réaliser au cours de ce travail. Alors, qu'est-ce qu'on constate? Dans notre réflexion,
What may we in our we realize that there is a plurality of actors intervene in the creation of strategies fighting against COVID-19. Then we are trying to classify these actors in some categories. In one category, the first category, we have the institutions, international institutions, particularly the World Health Organization, on intermediate levels. We have the institutions of governmental decisions, which are institutions that have received this information from the World Health Organization and that have created their strategies for managing the pandemics. And at the basis of this classification, we have actors of micro level that are at the foundation of this pyramid, at the basis of this pyramid, who have received all of this information, and they decide how they are going to behave vis-a-vis COVID-19. So then, after classifying these actors in these three categories, we pose the following questions. How are these actors negotiating information about COVID-19, and to what extent these measures have been and how these interactions have then lead us to apply these prevention measures and care, and how these relationships determine the decisions about these prevention contention measures. Then we have some factors that intersperse the OMS, the governments, and the bases. And these institutions and international institutions then become a system that create this operation, this system, and the working of daily lives.
Du système qui définit la liberté qui est sienne et la rationalité qu'il peut utiliser dans son action. Mais le système n'existe que par l'acteur qui seul peut le porter et lui donner vie et qui seul peut le changer. Donc, on a vraiment une problématique qui se situe au cœur des trois.
Then we have truly an issue that involves actors in the system and these actors who are outside of the system that has been placed.
Alors, ces acteurs qui sont au niveau macro, méso et micro sont tous concernés, comme nous l'avons dit tout à l'heure, par la lutte contre le COVID-19 en tant que système. Le changement ne peut s'opérer que dans les interactions entre ces différents niveaux. Les différents niveaux ne sont pas isolés. Au contraire, les différents niveaux ont des interactions, mais on verra comment chaque niveau assume des rôles et des responsabilités donnés. Alors, négociation en question. À partir du moment où il y a des acteurs qui vont essayer de se pencher sur la lutte contre le COVID-19, il faut également aussi des négociations. Ces négociations vont se faire à partir du moment où chaque acteur a sa construction sociale de la maladie. Tant au niveau macro, au niveau de l'OMS, les acteurs aussi ont leur conception, tant au niveau méso, les gouvernements aussi ont leur conception, et le niveau communautaire aussi qui a ses conceptions. Donc, nous logeons dans ces négociations avec les acteurs la maladie en tant qu'un construit social. Donc, les acteurs vont essayer de s'accommoder. C'est là où se trouve notre cadre de réflexion à partir de la théorie de Bass-Sanger sur la question des mondes sociaux. Au niveau de cette négociation, on se pose quand même quelques questions. Qu'est-ce qu'on négocie? Qui négocie? Où on négocie et pour qui on négocie? Donc, on a des acteurs qui sont là, qui vont se pencher sur négocier des comportements, négocier des stratégies, négocier l'application de ces stratégies pour qu'on puisse rompre la chaîne de contamination de COVID-19. Désolé. Ensuite, on a la déclaration de l'OMS. Le 11 mars, comme je disais tout à l'heure, c'était la déclaration de la pandémie. À ce moment précis, tous les yeux vont certainement se tourner vers l'OMS qui va tirer la sonnette d'alarme sur la situation épidémiologique de la maladie dans le monde. L'OMS va devenir alors la référence mondiale dans la lutte contre le COVID-19 et des stratégies de lutte sont diffusées à travers le monde entier. Alors, ce qu'il faut dire actuellement, c'est que le COVID-19 au niveau macro, comment les choses sont gérées. L'OMS va rapidement faire une cartographie mondiale de la pandémie et donner l'information médicale sur la question de l'origine aussi de la pandémie. Ça, on va comprendre, on va essayer de voir qu'il y aurait des incompréhensions, comme le dit Palais, dans la gestion du COVID-19 avec les gouvernements, ce qui signifie que le niveau macro va rentrer en relation avec le niveau méso. On a vu également qu'il y a eu des interrogations au niveau de l'OMS en termes de thérapie. En termes de thérapie, on a par exemple Madagascar qui avait été cité. On a également l'hydroxychloroquine et autres aussi qui avaient été dès les premiers moments annoncés comme étant des produits pour pouvoir soigner et guérir le COVID-19, mais des interrogations ont été posées à ce niveau, ce qui nous fait dire toujours que ces incompréhensions ne sont pas ces incompréhensions entachent un peu les négociations, j'allais dire des preuves scientifiques même, pour lever le doute dans la lutte contre le COVID-19. Donc, voilà comment l'OMS va structurer sa vision, sa conception de rentrer dans la lutte contre cette pandémie. Et toujours au niveau macro, on va voir que l'OMS va essayer également de s'accommoder aux principes scientifiques édictés. C'est-à-dire que les spécialistes au sein de l'OMS vont mettre en œuvre, vont demander à ce qu'il y ait une mise en œuvre dans chaque pays, un plan de riposte contre le COVID-19. À partir de là, les différents pays seront interpellés dans cette lutte, d'autant plus que l'OMS a fait la cartographie pour montrer aussi le côté dangereux de la maladie. Donc, le gouvernement burkinabé va s'inscrire en tant qu'acteur politique dans cette lutte et au regard du tableau épidémiologique livré par l'OMS et au regard aussi du tableau épidémiologique de son pays, même si ce tableau reste relativement faible dans la fréquence. Donc, l'allocution du chef de l'État va montrer l'intérêt ou l'importance de la lutte contre la maladie. Donc, ça veut dire que l'allocution, le discours du chef de l'État va essayer aussi d'apporter une certaine confiance. L'État va jouer également son rôle régalien dans le sens où c'est des textes réglementaires des textes réglementaires seront pris pour l'application et la coordination de la lutte contre la maladie. Donc, l'État va faire sortir un certain nombre de décrets, d'arrêtés.
Jordan,
Oui.
e todos os outros, eu estou no canal correto.
Oui.
E eu estou ouvindo a fala do Fernando para traduzir para o inglês. Eu vou tentar novamente
Oui.
aqui, mas eu estou no canal do inglês. Eu não sei se talvez a gente tivesse que ter aberto
D'accord, je peux poursuivre?
para esse contato, mas eu vou continuar tentando aqui.
Je peux poursuivre? Je peux aller?
Ah, bien sûr, Batiano.
D'accord. OK. Donc, à partir de cet instant, au niveau du gouvernement français et du gouvernement burkinabé, comment cette lutte-là sera organisée? D'abord, l'État va s'engager à instaurer un couvre-feu par 2 fois, de 19h à 5h et de 21h à 4h du matin GMT. L'État va procéder aussi à la fermeture des marchés, des lieux publics. L'État va effectivement aussi fermer les frontières pour réglementer la mobilité et éventuellement aussi pouvoir rompre la chaîne de contamination. Et l'État va mettre également des villes en quarantaine, telles que 2 principales villes qui étaient vraiment concernées, Ouagadougou et la deuxième ville qui est Bobo-Dioulasso. L'État va également aussi prendre des décisions par rapport au port obligatoire du masque à partir du 27 avril 2020, l'utilisation des gels hydroalcooliques, le lavage des mains et puis la mise en place d'un numéro vert d'appel téléphonique pour demander des informations dans la gestion du COVID. Et là, toujours par rapport aux stratégies, on verra la question de la distanciation sociale, la question de l'éternuement, des prisonniers qui ont été libérés, et puis beaucoup...
Então, os prisioneiros foram liberados e uma série de...
Dans la lutte contre le COVID-19. Il faut préciser que l'association sociale a toujours été une stratégie très difficile de négociation entre le niveau méso et le niveau micro. Ensuite, on a remarqué dans cette lutte contre le COVID-19, surtout au niveau, les incompréhensions au niveau méso, c'est-à-dire au niveau des gouvernements, on a observé des incohérences institutionnelles. D'où une question, ce que nous avons dit, une confiance en déroute. D'abord, ça a commencé par le décès d'une parlementaire, mais démenti plus tard, puisqu'au début, on disait que cette parlementaire, une dame, avait été atteinte du COVID-19 et elle en est décédée. Mais plus tard, les informations qui ont été recoupées donnent un démenti. Un premier fait. Deuxième élément, c'est la contamination au sein de l'équipe gouvernementale. Mais à notre sens, il y a eu deux cas hospitalisés. Donc ça, c'est le deuxième élément qui rentre dans la question même des représentations de la contamination. Troisième élément, au niveau des incohérences que l'État n'a pas pu gérer, c'est la question des thérapies. Il y a une thérapie au Burkina qui a fait la une de l'actualité, c'est l'apivirine. Voilà, c'est un produit qui a été expérimenté contre le VIH, mais qui est utilisé également, et puis il y a aussi à la pharmacopée. Et ensuite, quatrième élément qui a été soulevé, c'est qu'avec ces incohérences institutionnelles, l'État a révoqué le coordonnateur national du COVID-19. C'est-à-dire que dès les premiers moments, l'État a mis en place une coordination avec un coordonnateur de la lutte. Et avec les incohérences, ce coordonnateur a été purement et simplement radié, ce qui suscite encore de vives interrogations sur la réalité et la gestion du COVID-19. Ces incompréhensions et ces confusions, on les retrouve au niveau du micro, au niveau communautaire. Comment les choses vont? Le niveau communautaire, en dehors des stratégies, le niveau communautaire n'est même pas sûr qu'il y a un médicament contre ce COVID-19. Là, ça nous fait penser à un problème de gouvernance sanitaire. Les négociations avec la communauté, c'est-à-dire l'État qui négocie la communauté dans la gestion.
COVID-19. Negotiation with the community in terms of the community. We wonder, how can we then negotiate, particularly in implementing measures of COVID-19? Then these negotiations are going to take place on all of these three levels. And that involves the life conditions of the population, particularly when we are talking about the informal sector, because the informal sector is the majority sector. So with this informal sector, there are then distinct relationships in terms of its implementation. And these negotiations then have to do with social perceptions and the strategies of joining this negotiation. What are the strategies applied to these communities in order to produce outcomes during the pandemics? Many people stated that would be a disease of the wealthy, a disease of white people, that only in white population, white majority population countries, that would be the case. So then the state should have measures in order to prevent individuals or regulate the mobility of individuals. So the belief is that this disease was restrained to a particular social level, and that created a dilemma in these negotiations. So in order to negotiate these risks, there should be some measures taken in order to protect, but also to have these individual levels in order to understand what they would do. So we then needed to have medical specialists in order to provide us information about what is it to be, what are the symptoms, what are this disease entailed, and the symptoms when one is sick. And we needed to negotiate the risks. And how do we negotiate these risks in such precarious life conditions? These barrier measures, therefore, particularly for people who are in really precarious life conditions. Then the measure was, how are we going to distribute? To distribute, the measures were there. Let's distribute cereals, grains, and to maintain our economy. And also deal with issues of certainty as protagonists.
Quelles sont les stratégies qu'ils développent, les ressources qu'ils mobilisent. Donc, voilà un peu un certain
So then let's reflect with this population. What are the strategies that you are creating? How are you negotiating this disease? The dilemma of contradictions. And how are we going to negotiate these different social actors? Then we are working with this notion of negotiating risks. And we must then demonstrate this epidemiological status or the epidemiological circumstances in order to study then the circumstances. So this micro level are going to utilize very little these notions of isolation. And moving forward, these negotiations that take place in these three levels in terms of sanitary management, we then say that COVID-19 is a market.
Le COVID-19 en rapport avec leur business quotidien.
It is a social construction, but it is also understood as a market. It's an issue of social governance, but it's also an issue of how to manage information. And we have to use the scientific community in order to understand the pandemics. And on these three levels, we need to think about these negotiations. OMS, the government, and the population that is at the basis. We need to think about the macro level at OMS, but we also need to think about the responsibility of the World Health Organization at the level of therapies, treatment, There is the ideological level, the economic level, and in the micro level, we have the political gains. How can we then, since we have people on this level who are thinking in terms, and what is the attitude that people who are thinking positively need to have? We have circumstances, for example, in which several teams are presented to people who are asymptomatic, and yet they have a common life, and they don't protect themselves, and they don't take any type of measures in terms of governance.
Les motivations financières promises en termes d'indemnité ne sont pas versées aux personnels de santé alors que l'argent ne manque pas. Ils se partagent l'argent en haut, les autorités ministérielles, c'est pour faire allusion à ces gens, alors que c'est le bas qui fait le travail au quotidien. Vous voyez, les agents de santé ne sont pas venus ce matin. D'ailleurs, vu l'heure qu'il est, ils ne viendront plus. Là, c'est un personnel de santé qui parle d'un centre de dépistage mis en place.
In terms of governance, those who are responsible and those who are at the basis.
Donc, vous voyez, tout ça, ce sont des éléments qui montrent qu'il y a un problème véritable.
There weren't enough people to have. And then we have an issue of governance at Burkina Faso at the level of the frontier. We have a debate about those who are traveling around 100,000.
Le COVID-19 a fait de nouveaux riches. Donc, les gens en parlent. Nous avons eu l'occasion de rencontrer des voyageurs à qui il y a des gens qui sont là.
So, COVID-19 has produced new risks. And if we have people at the frontier who help people go over the border, who are making money in order to help people go over the frontiers or go across the borders, because each level plays different games and have different relationships. So we have a principle on paper that we have to perform and hence we need to understand the types of social relations in different environments, in international institutions, in medicine, in politics, in the economy, and that is a reorganization of issues of sanitation. And on a global level, we need to think about epidemiological issues, and we need to reinterrogate governance vis-a-vis global health. Thank you, friends. This is what I have prepared for you this morning as information, as relevant information for this population. And I apologize that I have some difficulties with simultaneous translation, so I hope you are able to get the gist of things. And I apologize myself, Raquel de Souza, because I was having some problems with the transmission of from the second to the third language. So since this our first time using 3 languages, My apologies to those who are listening. And now I'm going to invite our debater, Professor Kim, that I invited beforehand in the beginning. Professor Kim, she's got a 12-hour difference time zone, 11:30 p.m. in South Korea. We are so thankful for your presence, and we apologize for the fact that it's so late right now, a 12-hour difference.
Hi, everyone. My name is Yoon Kim. I'm a professor at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies in Seoul, Korea. Thank you for your invitation here to discuss this important, timely issue. And thank you for the presenters who have tremendous, fortunate and very successful their studies here today. I'm not a scientist. I'm more like a political scientist. So I'm not very well informed about the specifics and details of this measures of and different, issues in this COVID-19. I'm more like just a student of yours who are very curious about this issue and to know more about this. So maybe not as a scientist, but as a student of just in general, who are very interested in this issue, I'll just point out several things. And then I apologize that I don't speak or write or understand French, so probably I'll touch more on Professor Charbel's talk rather than for Professor Fernandez talk, because that's what I mostly understand. But I'll just mention a little bit about Professor Fernandez talk, but I'll focus more on Charbel's, because I already got his articles, published articles beforehand, before this presentation, so I can talk more about that. Anyway, what I understand mostly from your article, Professor Charbel, I think it's about knowledge, scientific knowledge production, and not no politicization of scientific knowledge. And I can agree with you more than that. I mean, yeah, I agree with you most of the time. But what I want to discuss today is that I want to focus more on the specific object of amassing interdisciplinary knowledge. I mean, the purpose of knowledge production. So what I'm saying is, depending on the object of promoting scientific study, the kind of response, the kind of things we react to the world, what we need, and the way we respond to this matter should vary. So I want to break down the object of promoting scientific study into 5 things. The first thing is to block or reduce transmission of disease. And the second one is to develop vaccine or medicine or some kind of cure by knowing the disease itself. And the third one is to disseminate the information about the disease to the public. I know that the Professor Charbel already touched upon these issues already in his talk, but just I want to have more discussion by breaking down this object into 5. So the first one is to make decisions on how to prioritize, allocate, and distribute the vaccine. And the 5th is to gather ideas how to live in a pandemic world, and how we shape the new mainstream leading ideas. So depending on the object of promoting scientific study, like into this kind of 5 objects, so I think our responses to this matter should vary. What I mean is that about the first one, to block or reduce transmission of disease, it's about whether to lock everything down, or whether we want to lift the lockdown. So it's the extent of lockdown or letting people freedom. So I think it requires an objective judgment, which could be made by collecting knowledge from every aspect of our society, like academia and administrative units, like government and also healthcare personnel. There wouldn't be a neutral opinion on this. So in each and every society, the measures could be very different. So we see that each country has its own way of controlling the disease, and also the success rate of lockdown are all different across the countries, meaning either that the consequence of it varies by society. I mean, how the people react to this kind of measure also varies. So there is no neutral or opinion or the best or right way. There's no such thing. So we need to collect different ideas and opinions from different aspects of the society to find out the best way we should deal with this, whether to lock down and how much to lock down, and whether to lift the lockdown, such things. However, in this first object, to block or reduce transmission of disease, I think collectivity or gathering ideas is not always the answer. What I mean is that it's especially when a quick decision is the most important thing in order to control the disease. So the timely decision is also important, not just the collectivity or gathering ideas. Perhaps the most important thing we should have done for this COVID pandemic was speed up two things: testing and getting the vaccine out. So there are sometimes things more urgent than collecting ideas. So I think I wanted to just point out that the timely measurement or decision is also important. And for the second object, to develop vaccine or some kind of cure, in order to understand the disease itself and develop vaccine or some kind of cure, doing it quickly is important, as I just said, and also understanding capitalism is important. I know that the professor already mentioned this, the cost and benefit effect. It seems that because it seems that market-based responses rather than a top-down approach are usually quicker and more effective, like we see in the Western countries. Although there is COVAX available for the poor countries, that's far short of the demands. But it does not contract Professor Charbel's idea in a way that we need to be more open to different ideas and opinions, but it additionally involves money. In other words, it's also about government spending and policymaking on market regulations regarding investment and import. How we allow investment and import by our policies. So it'll require more than our discussion for economists to talk about this issue, but I limit my role here to just raise this aspect to our discussion today. So I just wanted to mention that the first one was the timing issue, and the second one was like how to deal with the money issue. So sometimes the capitalist approach is more effective and quicker than I'm not saying it's only the right way to do this, but we have to consider this our nature of economics. And then the third object is to disseminate the information about the disease to the public. It's hard to discern what the facts are, not only because facts are politicized, it's because politicized, it's hard to find, hard to see what's the real thing we should believe, but also because the virus itself, the nature of virus itself, and its symptoms change because of the variant of the COVID. We really don't know what the virus really is, and also its symptoms change. The symptoms were really severe to death, like many people died because of this. Still many people died, but the symptoms have been changing, and maybe not as severe as before now, just in at least in my country. So we're not the mother nature, but just the scientists who analyze what is going on. So all we can do is being humble and persistently trying to figure it out while collaborating our global neighbors. So it's not pessimism or skepticism, but just knowing what we are, and it's not to be anxious, but keep it up to trying our best to figure out what they are. And then the fourth object is to make decisions on how to prioritize, allocate, and distribute the vaccine. On how to distribute the vaccine ethically and effectively, it seems most countries take similar steps to do this within the country. So the priority goes to healthcare personnel, residents of long-term care facilities, and then maybe seniors and so on. It's similar across countries, but how to distribute it around the world fairly might be a whole lot more difficult issue. I think Professor Fernandez talked about this as well at the three different levels of institutions. So this is one of the objectives that requires collective ideas most, I think, how to distribute around the world. Should we rely on capitalism that would let the price down, so available to the poor? Because it's very expensive now, but capitalists believe that if it is market-based approach and then capitalize everything, the price will naturally go down and it'll be available to the poor. But can we wait until we can trust them? Can we really do that? Or should we rely on international organizations like WHO to get funds from nonprofit organizations to buy and distribute vaccines in cheap price or for free? So this, I think, really is a conundrum. So we can think of, I think on the fourth object, we can incorporate Professor Fernandez's ideas more into this, this fourth object. And then the fifth object is to gather ideas how to live in a pandemic world, how to deal with it, how to live with it, and how to shape the new mainstream leading ideas. There are a bunch of different ideas how to live in a pandemic world, but what's going to be the mainstream ideas? What's going to be the new mainstream leading ideas? So there's no objectivity in this issue, in this matter, but only consensus or confusion. The shaping the new mainstream takes time with trial and error as people are adapting to the new reality. And across different societies, values and priorities differ. For instance, some may value individualistic freedom, whereas others value the good of the society and willing to sacrifice some of the freedom. Actually, it's an example of Korea. It's more like a society value the good of society and willing to sacrifice some of the freedom. But like in the US, they have collusion or confusion, like fighting each other, wearing masks, pro-mask, and then anti-mask. So without common consensus, the society is bound to face confusion or collusion. So they may value differences, even though there exists some confusion or collusion. So it's a matter of society with different cultures. So there is no objectivity in this issue, but we should figure out within the country or society with how to cope with this issue. So I just point out, I categorize into 5 objects, and then there are things that to think about, how we can respond to each category of the objects. So that's all I have for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Muito obrigada, professora Kim. Minha câmera voltou.
Thank you, Professor Kim.
Estamos aqui com já algumas perguntas.
We
para o
already have
professor
some
Fernando.
questions.
Aí eu vou pedir um auxílio do professor Felipe.
And I'm going to ask for the support of Professor Felipe
para fazer essa mediação.
in order to provide us with this mediation.
A pergunta veio do
The
Jaime Pinto Ramalho
question
Neto
come
no
from
YouTube
Jaime Pinto Ramalho Neto
para o professor Fernando. Ele
Professor
pergunta:
Fernando, and he's
desejo saber
asking,
do professor Fernando
I would
quais
like to
foram
know
as principais ações
what
das
were
forças
the main
públicas em Burkina
interventions from
Faso.
public,
Foram ações preventivas ou repressivas
how
no
were
controle
the
das
preventive
atividades na
measures
pandemia?
in terms
E
of
aí eu vou aproveitar
controlling the
e juntar
activities,
com a
and I
pergunta
am
do
then
professor
going to
Lívio.
join with the question from Professor
O
Lívio.
professor Lívio pergunta também para o professor
Is
Bationa
asking
em quais
to
aspectos,
Professor
no
Bationa, in
caso desta
what
pandemia, o Burkina
aspects in
Faso
this
se
case of this
diferencia de
pandemic,
outros
Burkina
países
Faso
africanos.
is different
Ele
from
fala da
other
maioria
African
dos outros
countries.
países,
He's talking about the majority
exceto
of other
os
countries,
países negacionistas,
except
como Tanzânia e
negationist countries
Madagascar.
such as Tanzania and Madagascar.
É isso, obrigada.
This is it. Thank you.
Alô? Professor Felipe, o senhor conseguiu contato com o professor Fernando? Só um momento, pessoal, estamos enfrentando uma pequena questão técnica, como eu falei para vocês. Essa é a nossa primeira tradução simultânea. Eu queria agradecer aos nossos expositores por estarem aqui trazendo tão generosamente de diferentes fusos horários e locais tantas informações de como foram lidadas, como foi lidada a pandemia, os seus usos e atributos em diferentes territórios. Muito obrigada. Eu não consigo visualizar o professor Fernando. Só um momento que estarei verificando, tá? Gente, o gerúndio aqui passou longe de mim, desculpem. O professor já foi contatado, ele está voltando. Eu vou aproveitar e trazer...
I am then going to bring a question. It's not actually a question, it's a comment to Professor Charbel. Professor Charbel, how do you see the moment of the political uses that have taken place here, particularly in the Brazilian territory that has been linking the scientific discourses? Because, For example, in a conversation with Professor Maria Kelly, I asked when did she feel that there was a problem while she had the Truth Commission that investigated the people who have vanished, and people started to ask her about this other side, if at any moment there has occurred the professor hearing or seeing anything that was as absurd in terms of thinking from now on it's only barbarian acts were going to take place. In terms of specifically the pandemics, if you ask me about it has many years, 6 years, when we had this in relation to the pandemics, it's right in the beginning when we had actually the investigations regarding chloroquine in terms of how it would be established a notion of objectivity in terms of mirroring reality and neutrality. But as we propose in terms of an interactive objectivity, and I started to wonder how if we had why was I concerned with the impact of chloroquine when I heard about the first test about this effect of chloroquine. I realized immediately that the article was very fragile, was extremely fragile, that it wasn't not even possible how it was published. And then the former president of the United States stated that it was a turning point. And then I was like, how is that possible? And of course, we start to wonder what were the interests, because of course, all of these corporations that promoted chloroquine were extremely happy with his defense, and other governments as well, and others who followed around chloroquine. So then I realized that something very strange was taking place with ivermectin, and we may never be naive in terms of missing the point of the political aspect of these arguments, but the level of disconnection that is observed in terms of ivermectin and chloroquine. I'm here in Portugal. I mean, not in Brazil. I was sent images of people singing the national anthem and holding a box of chloroquine in their hands. So there's a complete disconnection with reality. If we have a political debate about transmission of disease and contention measures, talking about human society, it's never going to be involved in anything that is not going to be a political debate. But what is different here? Just wait a minute. It doesn't seem to be anything that is connected to anything rational, because we should not forget that thankfully it's a minority of Brazilian society and the world society, but it's increasing. And I'm one of those people that in my family, I had people who stated that the governments are receiving money, and I was trying to draw them to reality, saying that isn't this money going to run out? And there was this fake news that the governments were receiving money by according to the death rates or by the number of people who are dying. Professor Charbel, another question. Infodemia, could you speak a little bit more about what identifies it in terms of the obstacle for literacy in our society? This is a very broad question. The first thing is I have issues in terms of literacy I think it's pointed out there's analogies and literacy, scientific literacy, but I think this big difference that oftentimes people lose sight of. When I acquire literacy, I am talking about a language that I already speak. And when people learn science, people are not literate in science. And it's different from acquiring literacy per se in a very crucial point. When people learn to only speak, if we take on this hypothesis that if it's not determining in terms of our thinking, is an important factor. When people learn to read and write in a language such as Portuguese or English, they already share many structural notions of their visions. And when people already know language and there is a possibility of a social cultural matrix. So learning science is very then acquiring literacy is different from learning science, and the notion of reading and writing is an issue of reading per se, literacy, scientific literacy that replaces then this notion, and these are two issues in terms of scientific literacy. If we are talking about people take years learning science and they learn very little at the end of it. Let's think about some of these reasons. For some reason, it has to do with different world visions and these demands, in my understanding, in terms of science, the training, the philosophical and sociological, so that they may join the conversation in terms of other thinking matrices, in terms of not becoming missionaries, trying to convert people from a more epistemological standpoint, because that then, on the other hand, we don't always have that type of scientific sophistication. And people then have argued that when this philosophical approach was then, if it's a knowledge that is conjectural, I know the truth and the truth is in the Bible and that's it, then it becomes difficult because we cannot have epistemological sophisticated debates one-sided. In the sciences is also another approach is that fourth and fifth grade has to do then respecting the rhythm of child and in which they deal with their perceptions. As it is as though, as Solomon stated, is as the train is going uphill, and then when the second and the third cycle of fundamental, then it becomes derailed. And researchers then ask, if you ask a student at the end of high school what he has learned, he has vague ideas. It is as much as talking to someone who was moving from one city to another just by riding on a train, because the science curriculum is like a derailed train in which people are learning tons of things. And oftentimes we try to teach science so much that people are not allowed to learn. So there's no possibility to learn everything because there's so much knowledge, and then millions of things then are taught that people are not useful. So at the end of the day is, how do you do this? What does it mean? How do you test a hypothesis? How do you accept a hypothesis? If people have more knowledge or more background to understand these issues, they would then be able to doubt the effectiveness of chloroquine, for example. What kind of samples do we have here, for example, to test this hypothesis? But people are not equipped for that type of analysis. That scientific education then has failed. And there's also something that in terms of reductionism that impoverishes the debate, meaning this is academic approach instead of understanding that that structural teaching has not helped people to learn about these debates, not thinking about how this structural training for these people who are acquiring a formal education. I think I have three questions here, a question here that I would like to expand to the three participants. We have then this wide range of misinformation available that has been a part of the collective imaginary. In Bahia, people are measuring their temperatures on the pulse. It has to do with fake news. So in this sense, from both from Professor Charbel and Professor Fernand, what are the tools that have been efficient in your territories in order to combat this misinformation? Let me share the floor. Professor Fernand has no internet available, and at the end, I'm going to read his answers. I'm going to do that in the end because he has already addressed one of the questions. So thank you, Professor Livio. I'm going to ask Professor Kim to share her opinions, her assessment, how combating fake news in your country and combating this politics of misinformation in South Korea. How do you see that? And then I'm going to invite Professor Charbel again. Professor Kim? Professor Kim, can you hear me?
Professor Kim, are you there? Eu acho que estamos enfrentando uma instabilidade de conexão, né? Eventos científicos online, a gente sabe que...
So this is what happens when we are dealing. Charbel, please. I just don't want to have a monopoly of this conversation, but it seems others are facing difficulties. What does not work is what I'm going to state first, is that OMS, what they have been doing, they have created a page to combat fake news, but that doesn't work when you have someone who states, look, you are talking nonsense, you don't know what you're talking about. That shuts down communication channels. I think that we need to open communication channels with people who believe these things and presenting a consistent argument so that something may come out of it. Of course, there may be a hardcore group of negationists, but there are many people who are not a part of this group who are receiving a mountain of information. You receive so much information that it comes to a point that you become unable to judge what's being proposed. So I think we need to look for more dialogue with people who have certain visions. If someone tells me that if they have shower with chlor, it doesn't matter if you tell them aggressively that they are learning nonsense. There's no way of... because people are going to be more likely to contaminate. If you're covered with chloroquine, that is not going to change anything, because you're going to continue to become contaminated with the virus, and you're going to have consequences in some. That's one path, and another more institutional path. I have already stated something here, which is teaching people in any space to have a more well-informed sociological and philosophical understanding, including academic centers that often take on a scientific approach, executing with very little understanding with this process of validation of scientific knowledge in scientific communities. And in my understanding, in Brazil, we have more education to study media in this situation of social network. I don't think we are going to have any changes, and people are then going to be immersed in the sea of information. People are going to be subject to infodemic, and people need to gain tools in order to understand, because it's going to be a miracle if we seek to have people who are subject to this mountain of information. How are they going to learn what is a good and a bad argument? And teaching people to do that, I think it should be mandatory at this point, in order, instead of having a discipline they are trying to create here, sustainability and citizenship. It is not something that you can teach in classroom settings. You learn that in different ways. I'd rather be teaching people to understand media. Discourse analysis is what we lack in this process of understanding ideologies that build and that are behind the meanings, and this is what a part of our educational process. Professor Kim, I'm going to ask you the questions again. The question is, what is your perception of the mechanisms to combat in your country in terms of combating fake news and misinformation? What are the politics that are going to be efficient in combating the spread of misinformation?
Yeah, it's very politicized. The information about COVID-19 here is very politicized between the conservatives and liberals. And now the incumbent party is liberal, and most of the media, they support for the incumbent party. So, but a lot of YouTubers and conservative supporters, they also very active online, like YouTube and Twitters and so on. But I think there could be some kind of checks and balances between the two different opinions by having evidences, and then, like I said, checks and balances to each other. So if you are making fake news and it's not approved by many others, you cannot get much popularity as you want in Korea. So if it is not really based on facts and evidences, the audience can discern somehow. I mean, so usually to the very extreme supporters, whether it's conservative liberals, that I asked them, because I'm more like a neutral person in here, so I asked them, how do you really believe what they say? And they said, if you are not correct, if you are not with much evidence to support your opinion, they cannot survive online, whichever side they are taking. So even if there's some extremists, they should bring up really believable and then convincible like evidences to explain what they are trying to convince. So maybe it's the public's judgment, and then more educated people should can tell between the real, the reality and the fakeness. But I believe there's no one who really like naively and purely believe what they are saying 100%. But you should show the evidence of what you're trying to explain. So to get some like thumbs up and like support even online, you should have more evidence, I think. So I think it's what it is going on in here.
Obrigada, professora. Chegamos aqui com mais algumas perguntas.
Thank you, Professor. We have a few more questions. It's 12:10. I'm going to wrap up the questions because otherwise we will keep going past time. Another professor, Professor Charbel, and then Professor Lívio is going.
WhatsApp, tá? Vamos lá, professor Charbel. O senhor acha que após pandemia poderá haver maior incremento do biopoder nos corpos da população mundial?
Do you think that there will be more power over the bodies of the world population and the loss of individual freedoms? I need to think about this concept of biopolitics and biopowers. Foucault and others. My question is, then has these limitations? If we were to think in terms of this limitation, I'm going to use a different concept. In terms of autonomy, it's a concept that I work with, particularly from the perspective of the questions of the autonomy of these biological systems. Autonomy is a system that should be different from the concepts of independence and freedom. It's not translatable in these concepts. If I were to think about a living system as an autonomous system, this autonomy understood as a pattern of organization that living systems generate the conditions of its existence. A living system is a beginning, middle, and end of itself. This autonomy is only exercised vis-a-vis issues of environmental issues once it may only be executed when this system comes out of thermodynamic system, absorbing high quality materials and giving it back low quality materials in terms of liquid systems. Then it goes beyond this thermodynamic balance and contributes to this environment that circulates. So this living system then entails dependence. From a social angle, it's only possible to be a social being if you have full freedom and autonomy. Full autonomy, not even solitary animals are able to achieve that, but they may protect their environment or their space. Since we are social animals as humans, I am in no way someone who's going to defend the social sciences. I am anti-reductionism, but I also think that it makes sense to think about social phenomena and not thinking that we are animals ourselves. And being social animals, we are not social animals in our lineage. We are members of a group that is linked as primates. They are social. They have been social for 50 million years. We've been descending from social animals for 50 million years, we may not be able to convince an autonomy of what that may not take place within the interactions with other humans, with other beings in society, and we are always going to be subject to power impositions. All social hierarchies from primates implies power relationships and powers that are exerted over other bodies from primates and others. And we are actually a bit different because since we are not only animals, we are not only symbolic animals, and many other animals are also symbolic, but certainly we have a symbolic life that is, there has no comparison to other animals. Symbolic animals that are considered. So we have invented ways of exerting power or that always go through the body, but they hover over the abstractions related to the body because we are capable of symbolic violences that are actually worse than the other types of violences that are exerted. So then we are going to have power exerted over bodies. So it seems like the pandemics is just another chapter that I'm not sure if it increases biopower or restrictions over people, but inaugurates changes in that sense. And why am I talking about this distinction between autonomy and freedom? Because I think that people are defending their rights, for example, of not wearing masks. What do you mean? It is something that we should have learned about in the cradle of our families. And one of the things that the families should state that freedoms stop when somebody else's freedom starts. So this is a basic social rule. If I am in a situation where it's possible to transmit a disease that is potentially serious, Kim has stated, we understand more and more why this disease affects some people more than others. We understand our body, then our reactions to the body, but there are other viruses that do the same. H1N1, dengue, they are able to turn a little key in our system using a method for diseducating or miseducating our system, and it starts to attack our own bodies. And these are very difficult cases to be treated. It is much more difficult to address issues that affect and dysregulate your immune system. So this is a lottery. It's not possible to know that you may have or may not have a serious case. You may transmit the disease to someone who...
Autonomia e liberdade, porque é todo um conjunto de pessoas que estão aí às gritas dizendo que a quarentena, a liberdade, isolamento social é a minha liberdade. Pera, né? Bicho social tem que saber por qual liberdade briga. E bicho social não deveria brigar pela liberdade.
So social animals should not fight over each other's autonomy, particularly privileged social animals, because of course I have colleagues who work with education about privilege and oppression rather. And one of the issues is that is to teach. It is a privilege for us to have social distancing. It is a privilege to be able to buy masks and buy alcohol gel and have soap and isolate yourself. Then you go into the streets to scream and contaminate impoverished people who don't have the resources to buy the necessary protection equipment. If your freedom, the privileged people are even or should be, but most of the privileged people are the ones who are screaming top of their lungs about their rights to be free on behalf of vis-a-vis the enslavement of others. And this is exactly what takes us back to enslavement, which is the power, because these privileged people are literally biological weapons in attacking populations that are less fortunate. I recently have talked about I have, and we haven't been shocked by the fact that a study has evinced that the number of people who are affected by COVID the most are essential workers, drivers, cleaning staff, and the vaccination rates for these people are very slow. As actually, we are able to see the situation of this, the dynamics of this biopower. Professor Lívio, please. I have some answers provided by Professor Fernand. In general, I am going to address the questions. He apologizes because he's having communication issues. We haven't had repressive measures. We've had the mandatory masking in offices and closed spaces. Then we had more preventive measures in terms of negationism. I asked about Tanzania and Madagascar. In that region of Africa, we didn't have this type of negationist interpretation and the cult to hydrochloroquine. And there is a consensus in terms of a Muslim majority in the country, and there's no negationist tendencies evinced. In terms of migration patterns, the question, there has been measures, but the virus is seen as a threat when it's introduced by outsiders, European and Chinese immigrants, but not in terms of the majority of immigrants who are local populations. They are limited, that are dealing with issues of violence in the frontiers. So I think this would be an interesting research. So this threat comes from outside. Then he adds that the state has been providing support measures, which is the majority of the informal sector, both in distribution of food as well as resources and money. And the spaces in which people. And then there's another question. So basically, that's what those were his answers. Thank you, Professor Lívio. So we only have one answer left, so that we can come towards our closing. And I would like to remind you that in order to receive a certificate, we need to have 75% attendance. And then at 1 p.m., we are wrapping it up. Once again, we apologize for the failures we've had, because this is the first time that we use the system with 3 languages. But next time we are going to have the issues curbed. He's thanking me and thanking Professor Felipe I would like to thank Professor Charbel, Professor Fernando, for sharing his time and his research and his perspectives in terms of helping us think about this complex society where we live. Thank you so much. I would like to thank you, Agência S9, for this moment and all this group that have supported us and the courses that are here with us. Fernand would like to also state that it has to do with the question about negationism in traditional medicine. He stated that there hasn't been any the traditional medicine and Western medicine, but there are communities who believe that traditional medicine cure, and there are actually several witnesses of people who swear they have been healed through traditional medication. So there is this tension, but it does not result in any type of political negationism in high spheres of power. I would like to thank you all. It's already midnight in Korea, so thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for sharing this information. Thank you to those who have been following us, and see you on Thursday when we are going to think about these complex issues that we are not going to find simple answers for, but we are trying to have our thoughts elaborated in order to improve our societies. Thank you. See you on Thursday.